If everything is relative, what can be more relative than relations between the sexes? Every week, your host, Jack Hammer, talks with a man or a woman on the podcasts Men Are Talking or Goodwill Toward Men, and aims to deliver at least one idea that will make you think, wow, I never thought of it like that. Today, Jack talks with a man on Men Are Talking.
Today on Men Are Talking, we talk with Justin Trottier, a co-founder and now the National Executive Director of the Canadian Association for Equality. CAFE, as Justin's organization is known, is a multifaceted assemblage of direct services to men in need, public education about the gender issues of men and boys, and political advocacy for changes and innovations in legislation and public policy. If there ever comes a time when male gender issues are completely resolved and CAFE is no longer needed, not likely anytime soon, Justin needn't worry about job security. He has the complete package of what any Fortune 500 company would need in a CEO. Hello, Justin Trottier.
Hello, Jack Hammer. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for your time. I'm very grateful. You are a busy man. So, Justin, I have to admit that I really didn't know much about you until a couple of months ago. Actually, I didn't know much about you until a couple of days ago when I started getting ready to talk with you. Mm-hmm. I really didn't know much about you. I had heard your name, but somebody on one of my YouTube videos suggested that Justin Trottier would be a good guest. So that's why I reached out to you. Since booking you and getting ready to do this show, I have studied up a bit about the Canadian Association for Equality, which I presume you refer to as CAFE.
Correct.
And I am just blown away by CAFE and the Canadian Centre for Men and Families under it, which is one of its projects. In my introduction, I believe I will be talking, and the audience will have heard some of the details of what you have done. But let's just suffice it to say right now that it's phenomenal, fabulous, amazing what you've been able to accomplish. And so my one question for today with many...
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. My one question for today with many details under it is, I know you didn't do it by yourself, but the question is, how did you do it?
Well, there's a long answer, I guess, to that seemingly simple question. I think that's a good place to start, though, with what you've just acknowledged, which is that this was very much a big group effort. And the origin story, for those who care to hear it, was that a number of us, myself and several others, were very involved in other nonprofit endeavors, other civil rights focused think tanks, in particular, organizations dealing with the issues and problems of different demographic groups. And what we found was that men's issues was often the elephant in the room. Like, I was quite involved with a number of women's organizations, in fact, and whenever an issue would come up that had, and many of them did, a perspective that men might bring, and in fact, my point has always been that one gets a deeper sense of some of these gender issues only when one's open to the perspectives of all, genders and people of all different backgrounds. So I would try to bring this up in as tactfully a way as I could, and I would regularly be shut down, either directly or implied. And so it became clear to me and to some of these other colleagues of mine that we really needed to create something focused on boys and men. That was really the only way to focus some attention in this area and make some progress on behalf of that particular population that I felt was being underserved. And so this group of colleagues and myself got together and started to think about how to do this, but to do it in a thoughtful way, in an inclusive way, not to be seen as or to be in fact a threat to anybody else. It's always been our point that, as I said earlier, philosophically, we believe men's issues deepen an appreciation for gender issues, but practically focusing on services for men, making sure men have access to supports when they need it, we don't see how that could not but be a benefit, not just to those men, but to their spouses, their children, the larger communities that they're a part of. That's always been our philosophical and practical kind of positioning. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've gotten some traction in some unlikely circles, right? To be able to do some of the work that we've done. So that's a short story in terms of how things kind of got off the ground, why we were motivated to set up Cafe in the way that we did. And then it was a long road. Despite trying to put our best foot forward, we definitely ended up rubbing some people the wrong way, got some protesters at some of our early events, got kicked out of some fairly high profile public events, some street fairs, a pride parade that didn't want to have anything to do with us. But we sort of took those as opportunities for educating the public about our point of view, and certainly growing our volunteer base, very, I think, shrewdly growing our donor base, by kind of leaning into some of those setbacks and asking people to rise to the occasion. And the way we would frame that is, look, people think all these negative things about us. Let's prove that they're wrong. Let's show that we're actually doing something very positive. To do that, we need your help. We need your funding. We need your people power. Get involved as donors or volunteers. And people really did stand up. And as I said, they rose up to the occasion in a big way. And in the early days, that was a very big part of how we were able to overcome those challenges and actually use them to our advantage. I could go on. I don't know how much more you want me to say on those earliest days.
I am an open book. You have so much to contribute to what we might possibly be able to do in the United States. There's nothing anywhere close to what you've done in Canada, unless I'm missing something. Do you know of anything happening in the United States that's even?
Yeah, I think there are some organizations. We've done some collaborative work with some of them, and they. And there are a couple that are like the National Coalition for Men that are broad based in terms of men's issues. There are some that are focused on particular areas, say domestic violence against men or parental alienation, and pushing for equal parenting amendments. That's a big focus for some U.S. groups, and we're very involved in coalitions with those groups as well. So it's a pleasure to work with them. I think maybe one area that's a little bit unique is the social service focus. Cafe blends advocacy and education with social services in a big way, kind of culminating this year in opening the first, at least in Canada, shelter for male victims of domestic abuse and their children. So it houses both single men, but also fathers and children. It's a family shelter. And that's where I'm sitting right now, in fact, is in the first of its kind emergency residential facility. So that social service blending with the education advocacy, that's probably a bit unique. But I mean, we're happy to be a part of these coalitions and learn from them where they do things differently from us. And hopefully in some ways we're able to, show a path forward that other groups might want to emulate.
You actually have a social worker on staff, don't you, in Toronto?
Well, quite a few. Yeah, in Toronto and at our other branches. So it's a professional organization in the sense that when we open these centers and we provide, social services, we do them through folks who are trained and experienced in their profession. So whether it's social work or therapy, psychotherapists, lawyers, as we do legal clinics as well, we pull sort of the best and the brightest from the professional world, and obviously we vet them. We make sure that they're aligned with us, that they're male friendly, that they're father friendly. So we do a lot to make sure that they're consistent with our values. But also we benefit from that knowledge base that they bring from their potential experiences outside of our particular community.
How many full and part-time paid staff people do you have?
Well, it varies from time to time, so I'd have to do a quick head count. But we've got 4 particularly active branches in Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, and recently we opened one in York Region. And for those who aren't familiar with the Greater Toronto Area, that's just north of Toronto. But it's a very fast growing community, so we set up a shop there. And we've got some what we would call more part-time-ish centers in some other locations in Ontario and in Western Canada. We will also be opening a full-time center in Vancouver once things settle down with the pandemic and it kind of makes sense to have facilities again. In all of these instances, we always hire an executive director, it starts often as part-time, but then as quickly as our budget allows, we go full-time. So we've got at least one full-time staff person at each of those branches. And then as things develop, we would often hire, usually by contracting out, services, psychotherapy, social work, legal services, etc. We would often enter into contractual relationships with professionals to provide some of those things. And then at the national level, we might bring on operations people, marketing people, but it does fluctuate. It's hard to give like an average, because it depends on what projects are working on, what opportunities are available in a given year. We might hire people short term to take advantage of that. And we also have summer students that we hire for short periods. Every year there's a federal grant that provides financial support for short term summer interns.
Fabulous. Amazing. So we will talk in a minute about the fact that the astronauts used to bring to our attention, which is no bucks, no Buck Rogers. We'll talk about how you raised funding for all of these ventures that you've managed to pull together. But let's stick for a second with that group of impressive, well, I said impressive, you didn't say impressive, that group of people that you started with. Who and what disciplines, what attitudes, what qualities were most important in that initial circle that helped to spawn Cafe?
Well, it's a really great question. You know, in the early days when you're starting a new nonprofit, and I've been in that position a few times now, you work with, whomever is available, and it's kind of rough and tumble. Let me leave it at that without going into the gory details. So emerging as an organization, you often have to find people that are a good alignment and a good fit. And it's not always easy. Not everybody is going to kind of make the cut, and you do sometimes lose some people along the way. And that's, I'm just kind of letting you in on the reality of how these organizations work. So it was pretty messy, I guess, in the early days. I think that required us to figure out what, philosophically was going to be our ideological core, and to quite intentionally set a statement of values that people would have to, would have to align themselves with. And if you look at our website, you can see that statement. They're I think, very reasonable requirements, being open to different points of view, embracing dialogue as a way to settle disputes, which means allowing people who are not, exactly where we are, but also there is a point where if you're no longer able to express yourself in a respectful way with one another, then you don't fit in the organization, right? Because it is rough and tumble, but it's about the ideas. We're arguing about ideas. We're not arguing about ad hominem attacks, that sort of thing. So that took some time, I guess, for us to establish what those values are, what will be our core kind of culture as an organization, and then finding people who had the right skill set to be able to create a professional charitable organization. And you have to look at practical considerations. You need people with financial management backgrounds, marketing and PR backgrounds, organizational development, so that you can create, policies and procedures to deal with issues as they come up. And it's taken, it has taken a number of years, but at this point we have a national board that is very seasoned. We've, check all the boxes in terms of the skills and the experience and the background that you would want to have on your board. We're now at the point where we've actually started building regional boards. So administratively and organizationally, because we're a national organization in a very geographically, spread out country, we operate through these semi-autonomous regional boards that do a lot of the local management on our behalf. So it's been kind of a complicated process to figure out how that's going to work. But we've now been able to find the right people to operate nationally and locally. So the organization is now able to continue to sustain its growth, which really wouldn't have been possible if you don't have people you can trust running your branches, and you're having to get involved in the minutia of every one of your branch projects. That's not a recipe for growing an organization. So we've had to tackle that, practical challenge of how do you sustain your growth financially and organizationally so that you can keep building. And we're sort of clearing a bit of a hurdle that should be able to open some future doors to more growth and opening more centers for men and families, for example.
So you've talked about some skill sets there, and it seems from what you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that the skill set sort of came as a second and third stage. The first stage was just having the right personality traits in the core initial group. Yeah. So exactly. You've talked about those personality traits, being open to consensus, being open to compromise, being open to different points of view. Were there any essential skill sets in that initial core group that you found especially valuable?
I think in the early days, we were doing a lot of big public events. That was one way to get known in the community. And so event organizing and marketing, figuring out ways to message our services, our educational activities was really critical. So we were lucky that we had people within our midst who had lots of event organizing experience. Myself, I had done some of that, but others as well. And that made it possible for us to do some of these big splashy events that got some attention, draft press releases that would get people's attention, and then present ourselves in a mature and thoughtful way. People would take us seriously. So communication, event organizing for us, because that was important to how we would, emerge as an organization, worthy of people taking seriously. I would say those were some qualities and some experiences that were important to us.
So actually having three-dimensional, not digital, in-person events was key to sort of saying, here we are and we're for real.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was obviously very much pre-pandemic days. So now it would be, I don't think it'd be possible to do it in the same way. But I think there's a tangibility to the in-person events that you cannot easily replace with virtual activities. And now that we've got the sophistication of a national organization, we were able to transition to virtual service delivery. So we've moved to, during the pandemic, it was 100% therapy and support groups and legal clinics and all the other programs were being done virtually. We've now returned to a bit of a hybrid. So still all the virtual stuff, but we're now doing some in-house as well. Obviously, the shelter, it's a facility. You can't stay in a shelter virtually. That doesn't make sense. So people are actually here. So it's very much a hybrid model. Post-pandemic, we're going to keep the best practices that we've learned from doing things remotely and try to combine both approaches. But yeah, in the early days in particular, because it was important to create a sense of community and camaraderie, and getting people out to these events I don't think there was an alternative to the effectiveness of going that route. And quite frankly, the protests that we had, which can only happen, of course, in a real, auditorium setting, was in fact to our advantage, quite frankly. It didn't maybe feel that way at first because there was a lot of, it was difficult. We had people with placards and shouting all kinds of hateful things, and frankly, we did lose some people who just couldn't take that. And I understand that 100%. But looking back now, I have the benefit of hindsight, and I can see how that actually brought people together. Because most people, they instead of, running for the hills, they actually said, this makes no sense. Like, we know we're doing something really profoundly important and unique. We're not going anywhere. In fact, we're going to increase our level of volunteership or donations, or, we're just going to make sure that we stick this thing through, stick with this so that we can demonstrate to the naysayers how vitally important this work is. And if anything, I think it galvanized people's, positive response to wanting to do something good in the midst of this negativity and hatred. And, in fact, in the long run, it grew the organization in those early days, and the protesters sort of dissipated when they saw that we weren't going anywhere. I mean, maybe some of them were actually convinced we had something valuable to add, but I think probably most of them just got bored and got distracted by some other, offense that they thought was more worthy of their time. So in the first couple of years, yeah, we had to deal with that. But as I say, it proved to be in the long run to our advantage.
Very good. your academic background is engineering.
Yes.
Correct?
That's very correct. And totally, out of my element here. I don't know how I got into this.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. The thing I like best about engineers is that engineers never say, whatever.
Right.
There's always an optimal way to proceed. And if they don't have the optimal way, they're going to optimize until they get to the optimal way to proceed. You know what I'm talking about?
I think there's a resourcefulness that is, it's either trained into you as an engineer or it's a person who has that kind of can-do, I'll find a way, a path forward attitude that is gravitating to engineering. So I do think I have some of those qualities, that I don't shy away from a fight very easily. If I think that I'm right, I've got the evidence to back up my position, then I'm not going to back down easily. And I think that a lot of us are coming at this from the point of view that this is so critically important. There's so much at stake that we had better find a path forward. Right. And so in the early days when we weren't, getting, major sources of funding, still difficult to get, say, government to fund this, and a lot of nonprofits, and especially social service ones that have, significant budgets. If they don't have government as a major funder, they're dead in the water. They don't survive more than a few years. We've found a way forward, and we've been able to make the case to thousands and thousands of individual donors, particular Canadians, but even internationally as well, to support what we're doing. And in other ways, we've managed to find a way to rise to the occasion. As I mentioned, if we get booted out of a parade, we're able to turn that into a positive message of that rallies people to support us. So we find these creative ways to be successful, even in the midst of these challenges. And I think that's a skill set that a lot of us who lead the organization have had to develop. If we didn't have it to begin with, we've had to develop it, and we're very much invested in finding paths forward because we think what we're doing is critically important. I mean, I get to see it. I'm privileged because every day I see it in the way we're supporting men who are struggling in various kinds of crises, whether they walk in through the door of the shelter because otherwise they'd be homeless. Police just kick them out of their house because they're victims of domestic violence, but police still kick them out for some reason. So they come here. Or sometimes men who are just dealing with serious mental health issues. Maybe they're, at the point where they've thought of suicide, and we're able to provide them with a lifeline and support them through that crisis. And that really is, those are the stories that keep me going, because to get to see that transformation happening on the ground is very invigorating, in terms of wanting to continue to do this work, and when there's challenges to make the most of them so that we can help more of these families in crisis.
So I wonder if in engineering school you felt somewhat, different, insofar as you have not just the left brain ability to do engineering, but you also have the right brain ability to develop something like Cafe the way you've developed it. It's about people. So can you answer that question first? Did you feel like you were more, emotionally aware and intelligent than your average engineering classmate?
Yeah, first of all, I should say I don't like talking about myself, but since you've asked, so I never fit into engineering, and I learned that kind of midway through. Too late for me to change my career trajectory, or at least it was too late to get out of the engineering tract, but it wasn't sort of too late for me to use my time at university to find other ways of kind of fulfilling the lack of I guess, passion that I found I had for my scholastic endeavors. So what had happened was in the last couple of years in particular, I started to gravitate more towards extracurricular activities, volunteering in the community, some social entrepreneurial pursuits, etc. So that by the time I graduated, it was clear I was not going to spend a day as an engineer, and I never did. Except I did a co-op program in the middle, but I never worked after I graduated in my profession, and immediately went into some nonprofit work. Not Cafe at first, but some other nonprofits, as I mentioned earlier, some mostly around civil liberties kind of work, and then ultimately to co-found this organization. So yeah, I would kind of notice that my engineering colleagues were very subsumed with, getting the best marks they could and kind of squeezing as much out of the engineering experience, which is great. I mean, they're going to become great engineers, and we need that. But I found that was not where I was getting my fulfillment. It was more from these other pursuits that were hybrid, academic, and people oriented, as you put it. And I ended up making a career out of that, at least for the time being.
Very good. Just quickly before we move on to another topic. So you never really felt like you fit into the engineering curriculum, the engineering ethos. I'm putting words in your mouth. Correct me if I'm wrong. But still, they put engineering into you. And so I wonder if when you think about Cafe and what you want to do with Cafe and your plans for Cafe, are you thinking of a schematic diagram?
Not really. I'm just being honest. I don't know if I should let your listeners in on this, but the organization tends to grow in a fairly organic and not always a 10,000 feet in the air looking down kind of masterminding approach. We have in recent years taken more of a strategic planning approach, but pardon me, it's still the case that we often are confronted with unique opportunities that cannot be planned. And, a donor comes and says, I think you should open a shelter and here's $100,000. Okay. I mean, that's a lot of money, but it takes like $500,000. So if we're going to do this, then that's going to end up taking a few years and it's going to mean a giant investment of time and energy. But can you say no to $100,000 when you wanted it to open a shelter for many years and a lot of your, members and board members, that's been a dream of theirs. So you have to make a difficult decision as to whether to, not so much change course, but just to greatly emphasize one particular aspect of your mandate for the next several years, to make that project a reality. And that was one of our most pivotal and consequential decisions, which we, of course, decided to go that route. There may be spontaneous elections that get called and, now you're scrambling to try to make the most of some advocacy campaigns and to get some progress by having political activities during the election. Those things are sometimes, you can plan in our Canadian system. Sometimes the elections come and you don't know they're coming. So that's an interesting thing about living here. So there are those opportunities. And then there are, smaller ones. Somebody, volunteers to be a keynote at a conference. So you've got to sort of change your whole plans around for that event. So it's pretty hard to, plan things to the point where you know exactly what's going to happen and what events you're going to have and what campaigns you're going to have, a year or more out. But we have tried to have overall plans, like strategic directions we want to go in. In the next 3 years, we want to make sure we get X, Y, and Z done. How exactly we do that, that's where we might have to be nimble to respond to opportunities as they come up. And we've developed, I think, a very good culture where the board expects that we're going to follow our overall plans, but is also very open to proposals either from me or from sometimes the branches, because we've got a very dynamic set of branches that are running on full pistons, not quite independently. I mean, National supports them in a big way, but they've got a life of their own. And sometimes they propose some interesting ideas that, we hadn't thought of. So one of the great things about having all these branches is that they can pioneer ideas and we can see if they work. And if they do, then we can borrow that and bring that to some of the other centers that we operate. And some of our kind of flagship programs were bright ideas one branch director had, and it proved to be very successful. And so it was brought to some of the other branches. So, for example, we have a fathering after separation and divorce program, first of its kind in Canada, provides support to dads in a family breakup context, and in particular helps develop co-parenting plans. And so that was successfully unveiled at one of our branches, and now all of our centers, the 4 or 5 active centers, are providing that to dozens of dads on a regular basis. So we have these kind of laboratories, each branch is able to experiment in that way, and then we can borrow when things work spectacularly well.
Wow. Amazing. A fabulous, perfect combination of left brain, right brain, and engineering and organicity. It's really impressive. So, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. You are recognized by the Canadian government as a legit charity for which people can claim deductions when they donate to you.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I imagine that your funding, your finances, your budgeting is public info. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Yep.
So may I ask then, what is the overall budget, the annual budget for CAFE?
So it sits right now at about $500,000 a year. Somewhere between that and $600,000 or $700,000. We've had a couple of, just before the pandemic, we had a couple of very good years. The pandemic has slowed us down a little bit in terms of private philanthropy, which has been the biggest contributing factor to the growth of the organization. But sort of just in time, we started to diversify. So we're now getting much more money than we've ever had coming from foundations. Some even from government. And so we've had a couple of particular project grants. We had one, this one is very, I'm particularly proud of this one, from the federal government. Probably a lot of your listeners know our federal government is very much in the feminist camp. But despite that, through their homelessness Office of Homelessness, I forget the exact name, but anyways, it's a sort of a research arm of the government that's looking at strategies, homelessness strategies, actually, there you go, that's exactly what it's called. So that's an agency looking at innovative ways to combat homelessness across Canada. Anyways, they funded us to do some research into the intersection of male domestic violence and homelessness. So trying to look at to what extent men are homeless as a result of domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, that sort of thing. And so we actually were able to go into some shelters in Toronto and figure out, well, how many men are here because of domestic violence? And it was interesting because when we pitched the idea to these shelter managers, they didn't think very many men were there for that, but they said, okay, well, we'll let you do your research, but you probably won't find anything. Well, we actually did find that a significant number were there for domestic violence. And often that was one of many factors, of course, but it proved to be one of the main reasons that in some shelters men were there. So that was a federal grant, and there was a provincial grant of a significant amount to get our Alberta branch opened in Calgary. So we're getting some government interest as well. Foundations, government, some corporate sponsors, but still the private philanthropy, especially with the new projects, the new centers. It's pretty hard to get government and even foundations to take a chance on a new center or a new project, especially when it's for boys and men. But if you can, but what we found is that if you can get private philanthropists to take that chance, and we've got at this point quite a number of individuals who are able to give a significant amount on a new project, then we can go to some of these other funding sources and get them to match it. So so I want to be clear that we still are benefiting in some unique ways from the private givers. But we, en masse, we're able to diversify, and it makes the organization financially much, much healthier than it would otherwise be.
Okay, very good. I noticed on the website the current number that is listed as your progress toward the $500,000 goal, which I presume is for the actual physical facility of the shelter for men?
Yes, exactly.
You're at $466K. So were you able to
probably
open...
an old website. No.
Yes, it was. I think the number, the date was several years ago. Yes. So
okay. No, it's quite possible that you found a current web page that is out of date because our website needs work. Okay. So that's one area that we're not quite where we should be on. But yeah, so the shelter has opened. We did surpass the $500,000, and we continue to of course fundraise to sustain it. But we did succeed in the capital acquisition side of opening up the residency.
Very good. Very good. So what do you figure is the annual budget to sustain it?
Well, I think if we can continue to raise the $500,000 a year, that would be sufficient. But if we're going to continue to grow beyond that, opening up any new centers, we're probably looking at having to, get well over the $500,000. We've kind of gotten to a point where we think we need to spend some time making sure that we're on a sustainable footing before we have any more major growth projects. So that's actually one challenge, because we've in a way set ourselves up for a situation where our supporters just assume that we're going to keep opening centers and shelters like every year, and we're going to have to explain to them that if we keep doing that and it proves to be unsustainable, then we might lose everything. So nobody wants that. So we're probably going to take some time to just take stock of where we're at, make sure that we're on a sustainable footing before we do any other major growth. We've committed to opening a full-time center in Vancouver. We're actually almost done our fundraising campaign for that. So that will happen. But after that, we are probably mostly going to be looking at building a solid, foundation to allow for any future new projects to be successful. Yeah. So we have to do this in a thoughtful way. And again, a lot is at stake. So we don't want to have any branches or facilities have to shut down because we move too quickly. I mean, that's not to anybody's long-term benefit.
Well, you are amazing. I want to go back to the idea of the federal grants and the funding you get to run projects. When you get such a project, do you contract out with the right people who can execute the project that you've been funded for? And second question would be, and do you keep a piece of that funding as overhead, the way every university does when they get funding from the federal government? There's money for the actual project, but there's money for the overhead that makes it possible for the project to have a home.
So I'll take the second one first because it's a little bit easier. So most granting agencies are now, aware in a way that they haven't been in the past. They're a little bit more sophisticated now, so they understand that charities do have legitimate overhead. Pardon me, and so they're open to a percentage of the grant being assigned to administrative staff and overhead offices and things like that. They usually cap that. So you can't declare more than a certain percentage, but if you get enough of these grants, you can cobble it together and fund your overhead that way. So that's not 100% of the time, but most of the time you can introduce an element into your budget for that. What was your first question again about government grants?
The staffing of the project.
Yeah, the contracting out, right. It depends. So the one I mentioned earlier, which was a research grant, we absolutely contracted that because we wanted the research to be done by a disinterested party. We wanted there to be arm's length between the charity because we're known to have an agenda and the actual research. So we went to a graduate student who is associated with the university, and the university, he went through like ethics review at his university. And so when we published the research, it was sponsored by us, funded by the federal government, but done by this arm's length researcher. So that's been the case for research projects. But sometimes the grants fund our social service programs, and those are wholly owned and operated by us. So those would be done sometimes by volunteer facilitators, like our Fathering After Separation group, our support group for men who have gone through domestic abuse. We have a false allegations group for men experiencing false allegations. It's a combination of social support and legal support. So all of those programs have been funded at least partly by grants. And those are all, as I said, fully operationalized by us as a charity. So in those cases, no, we have in-house volunteers or staff that would provide those programs.
Very good, thank you. The board that you have assembled, pretty much handpicked by you?
By a nomination committee. So there's a process. I mean, and again, in the very early days, it was take what you can get. And we were lucky in that we got a lot of very good people. But now we're more selective, and there's a more rigorous process to review applicants. And sometimes people nominate themselves, but also we go after them. Like we as a board, through the nomination committee would, rigorously scrutinize all the various, branches and centers for some potential local, representatives that we want to put on the board. We're also aware that we have maybe certain gaps in the skill set of the board that we want to appoint to fill those gaps. So we'll go out and look for those people. There are some minimum requirements. We're very strict that somebody has to have had, a couple years of experience in a senior role with the organization. So we want to be careful about bringing people in from outside. We sometimes reserve a limited number of spots for people outside the organization, but the uniqueness of CAFE, in particular, its sort of political, ideological philosophy, is such that we have to be very careful. If we pick even one wrong board member, it could be very disruptive, if not fatal. So we're very selective in that respect. Some experience with the organization at the senior level is essential, and then it's about finding the right mix of directors and zeroing in on who can complement the existing board members. And one of the kind of intangible skill sets, if you want to call it that is essential, is a ability to be good-natured about disagreements. Not everybody has this quality. But when you're dealing with an organization with 12 directors, and we're having to make very difficult decisions, and we're dealing all the time with opposition to what we're trying to do, and sometimes it's more intense than other times, but it's always there. You really need to be able to roll with the punches and be able to engage in debate and disagreement, sometimes very passionately, never disrespectfully, but sometimes very passionately, without feeling like you're personally being attacked. And we've had a couple of people who were not a good fit along those lines. But at this point, we have a board that is running on, full pistons, and everybody is willing to, put their position out there very strongly, argue for it, but not take it personally when other people do the same, and then live with the outcome of a democratic decision.
And so a quick look at your board of directors suggested to me that, unlike a lot of organizations, you picked your board because they had subject matter expertise in one way or another, rather than looking for somebody who was going to contribute $1 million a year to the organization as a condition of being on the board.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. We do not have a, financial litmus test for board members. I should just clarify, because we do have a board and what we call an advisory board. So they pretty much sound the same, but they're different bodies. And so the advisory board, these are academics mostly, some non-academic subject matter experts, as you said, or other professionals, medical professionals, journalists, lawyers, who bring an expertise in a given area. And they're vital. We go to them when we're starting new projects that is along the lines of an area that they're an expert in. We oftentimes, when the media asks us for information, this is a great resource. Either we put them in front of the camera, or we ask them, the questions we don't have the answers to, and we gather that for the media, and the media then looks at us as an authoritative resource. So that's been good for us. The board of directors, the people that are responsible for supervising the organization and making these tough decisions, those individuals, some of them are academics, most of them are not coming from that background. That's where that practical mix of skills is critical. Financial management, human resources, marketing, like you want to have all of that represented on that particular board, because when you're making decisions, you often want to have all those different, experiences that people as a body can bring to bear on a difficult matter.
How early in the existence of CAFE was it? Maybe it was late. How early, how late? Where in the growth of CAFE did you hire your first or contract with your first fundraising development person?
Oh, pretty late, in fact. And in fact, for a long time, I was the only paid staff person. So, I was hired formally in 2015, so just after we opened the first center in Toronto. We were already active for a few years then, purely as 100% volunteer organization. We realized at that point when we opened the first center, no, we've got to have at least one person on staff, and that was me. And then we started hiring some operations people as the branches grew and we were delivering more services, and fundraising was being done by myself and volunteers. And then we reached the point where the organization had the budget to hire. It wasn't a contractor. We actually have an in-house fundraiser since 2018. So a few years had gone by, and that was because we realized there was a lot of missed opportunity from grants. There's a lot of government and foundation grants available. We were seeing other charities, get access to them, and realizing, well, it won't be easy because a lot of these granting agencies have no history of giving to men's services. Yet when you look at what they're giving to, programs to prevent suicide or programs to respond to victims of abuse, we were doing all those programs, right? So why shouldn't we at least compete on an equal footing with some of these agencies? And we had started applying to grants before we hired the director of development, this full-time fundraiser, and we could see there was some opportunity there. We were starting to get some traction. So we wanted to, lean into that in a big way. And that's why we made that particular hire. And we've started to therefore grow our relationships with these granting agencies. And what we've discovered is very often we would be declined the first time around, but we would learn why we were declined. And if it had something to do with their preconceived notions about either CAFE as an organization or just the issues, men's issues, we would be able to educate them and make the case. And maybe the second or the third attempt, we would actually get some money. So we were just having to accept that it would be a long-term relationship building exercise as much as it is writing grant applications. And we're still doing that. I mean, that's very much still a work in progress, but we're started to turn some corners with some pretty major funders in the foundation world.
So even if you were rejected, you would need to have a personal relationship with somebody in the organization that rejected you so that you could ask the question, why?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of this is relationship building, and obviously with individual donors it is, but it is to a lesser extent also in the world of grant giving. And so the staff at these agencies would often be there for many years. You'd get to know them. And they would get to trust you more, I guess, as an organization and as a representative of CAFE. And after a few attempts, they would be more open to considering you as a legitimate resource for funding purposes. Yeah.
So you've just talked about funding for projects. What about philanthropies who just got a lot of money and they want to put it in a place that makes them feel good about themselves?
Sure, we'll take it.
Do you have much success with that kind of funding?
Yeah. So, again, in the first couple of years, that's almost 100% what we had. Not that everybody was like cutting us 5-figure checks, but we had the traditional kind of pyramid where there were a few really big donors at the top, and then a lot of donors in the middle or at the bottom. And I think that's why we're a healthy organization, because we don't rely on just a couple of giant donors who may one day run out of money, run out of interest, not be available to us for one reason or another. So that's part of the diversification along the lines I said earlier about diversifying the different kinds of funding. So also getting money from governments and other granting agencies, etc. But in the very early days, we took what we could get, and the lowest hanging fruit was the individuals already committed to the cause. So we would start there. We would make the case to them, and a few of them, lucky for us, and I guess for them, were very wealthy, and they were willing to take a chance on us. And we delivered, and so we'd go back to them and ask them to renew that commitment, and they did that several times over. And what we would do is we would run these matching campaigns, right? So a donor wouldn't just donate $50,000; he would match up to $50,000. Well, now we could go to thousands of smaller scale donors and ask them to step up, knowing the benefit of doing so. And that's how we built, I think, just about all of our centers was through one or another form of matching.
Very good. A few minutes ago, you used the phrase "unlikely circles." You got acceptance from some unlikely circles.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about which ones were the most unlikely that you were able to win over, and which ones were the most important to win over and worth every bit of effort it took to develop trust with them?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot here I could say, and this is a question I'd love to go on at length because I'm so proud not of just of me because I've done some of it, but of the group, because a lot of people have put in so much time and effort in the organization to open some of these doors. But I think the best example would be with the family shelter, because to get this place opened, we had to knock on. To get these doors open, we had to knock on some uncomfortable doors, right, in the community. And we were able to build an advisory board. We set out intentionally to do this, build an advisory board for the family shelter. I mentioned we have one for the organization at large, but this was specifically for the shelter. And we were looking at experts in running domestic violence programs or actually running shelters. And partly it was practical. We wanted to find out how they run because they're complicated, facilities, but also to show that we meant to be as inclusive as possible. So we actually would have conversations with executive directors of other women's shelters, or of women's shelters. We would have conversations with individuals that provide support services to women's shelters, even if they are not shelter staff themselves. So, for example, across Ontario, there are in hospitals nurses trained to support victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. So somebody comes into the hospital, to the emergency room. It's clear they're there because of a domestic assault or a sexual assault. These nurses, they're trained to deal with that, and they form their own organization. They started inviting us to give webinars in how to deal with male calls because they were getting more and more men presenting as victims in this way, and they didn't know what to do with them. So there was a relationship there that they initiated. So then we ended up inviting them to be a part of the advisory board, and they agreed. So we also had the Assaulted Women's Helpline, which is a very pro-feminist organization in Ontario that supports the women's shelter sector. And one of their managers joined our advisory board. That flabbergasted me when she met me at our Center for Men and Families and vetted us and said, yeah, I can see what you're doing is valid. I don't maybe agree with everything, you say or do, but I want to support this because we have enough in common that I want to throw my support behind it. And this individual didn't just join it, but she's been one of the best resources in terms of understanding the nuts and bolts of how you actually make a shelter work. It's one thing to open it, but you got to make it work. So she's been really critical in terms of that aspect of it. The victim services sector has been one of our strongest allies. And when we were about to open the shelter here, I made the acquaintance of the lady that is the president of the Ontario Network of Victim Service Agencies. And so she represents maybe 60 or 70 of these victim services offices across Ontario. And she's pretty senior in the Ontario government in the Ministry of the Attorney General. So through her, we were able to start to get government subsidies for trauma therapists. So that now when a man comes into the shelter and needs emergency trauma support, that therapy is funded by the provincial government through that connection that she opened up. So these are all, relationships that I a few years ago would not have thought this would have been possible. In Alberta, where we've got some very active branches, it's the same story. We've actually been accepted as a member of their coalition, their anti-domestic violence coalition. So that's 50 or 60 organizations in Alberta that do frontline social service work for victims of abuse. Getting into that coalition was not easy and took some time to make our case. But we're now a member of that, which opens some doors possibly with government funding, but makes us legitimate, in a way that we otherwise wouldn't be. So there's definitely some, unpredictable opportunities that we've taken advantage of, and really tried to build the relationships that would make us authoritative as an organization and then allow us to take the next step with fundraising or producing even more relationships. I think the most recent example, and then I'll pause on that, is with the Toronto Police. So Toronto Police, historically not the best friend to abused men. I mentioned, they still routinely remove a man from the home, even if he's the victim, and all the evidence shows that he's the victim. but at least they're now aware of the shelter and they're making contact with us. And we've had a few men come in because of the local police connection. And they've recently invited us to join one of their community safety boards, where different community agencies get together and deal with situations of high risk in the community. So we're now a member of that. And again, that gives us a legitimacy among all the different organizations involved. But it also means, practically speaking, we're aware of, safety concerns in the community. And we also have another resource for our own clients. So if we've got a man who is needing not just our services, but more of a wraparound approach, we can then go through this board and get him those additional resources. So there's lots of things, there's lots more we can do by not doing everything ourselves or going it alone. I know some sort of more in the men's rights sphere, they sort of poo-poo, relationship building. They have more of sort of a puritanical view of how people should only work with other organizations exactly like theirs. That's not how we operate. We think there's a lot more in common than that divides us between CAFE and many, many community groups. And I think it does us a disservice not to look for those opportunities to make common cause. That doesn't mean we compromise our values. It doesn't mean we do things any differently. We found ways to do things in a male-friendly, father-friendly way, but to gain those relationships that I think are critical.
That's wonderful. So let's end on that very positive note. And it seems especially positive and optimistic insofar as what you're saying is organizations that don't like you now might be some of your best friends in a little while if you can develop a relationship with them, which is especially optimistic for us because we have so many of those enemies right now.
Well, if I can say one more thing on that, because I kind of want to make, and I want to emphasize the case for finding friends in unusual places. We should not assume that everybody in the women's service sector, the feminist sector, is of the same mind. I mean, there are radical differences between those organizations. And so when you lump them all as the same, you're reinforcing their similarities, and that's to our disadvantage. It's much better to find the friends and allies within the women's social service sector and pull them closer to what I believe is the progressive position, which is providing support to people regardless of gender, than it is to push them even further towards the extremes of their own sector. So when we're more open-minded, when we're more looking at common, beliefs and opportunities for finding common ground, we're going to be able to make some very positive progress just in the whole delivery of programs and services across the sector.
Very good. Justin Trottier, it has been a real pleasure to talk with you, and I am just amazed at how good you are at what you do. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye now.
Thanks for listening to Men Are Talking. Did we deliver? Did you hear something that made you think, wow, I never thought of it like that? If we did, tell your friends.